you now have like this experience that you can kind of fill in the gap of like if you were building applications 10 plus years ago, you can now recreate those experiences in serverless functions. And that kind of really just opened up like what Jamstack was, but also what you could potentially do.
This is What the Jam, an interview series where we're finding out what's next for Jamstack. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org. I'm joined by Brian Douglas today, who's been very involved in the Jamstack community. He was very early employee of Netlify and predated Jamstack at Netlify. He's host of the Jamstack Radio, a podcast all about Jamstack, and has done a lot for the Jamstack community and to push the term and have it become popular. So really excited to have Brian here today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for the invite, Mike.
So let's start off with what does Jamstack mean to you at this point in time?
Yeah, at this point in time, I guess anything that's not server-side rendered. But I think even that's being stretched as well today. Like as you see, like the advancements in Next.js and like in React server components, like the extent of what the Jamstack was, like it keeps expanding. And like if I zoom back, like that's what it is today. It's basically like it's a way to do your front end applications. Um, the challenge of the Jamstack and having the term is like when it wasn't modern to do like build web apps and websites, you needed a term like Jamstack. But we're seeing a renaissance of now that is what everyone's doing.
Yeah.
And now we're looking at what's coming next. So when you start seeing like the introduction of like WASM, which kind of like extends what you can probably do on the web and what you can do in just JavaScript or maybe do Rust on the front end, like that's completely changing this app like together. But if you don't mind, I'll take a little bit of step back on like what the Jamstack was. So I joined Netlify as employee number 3. I came on board to convert their Angular app into React. React was like pretty newish, like it was getting mature basically at that point. Like they had got class components. It was a couple years before hooks, and Netlify had made the decision to switch to React. So I knew React. I got hired, and that was my role. And as Netlify got a bit more traction, then the question that came through support. So every engineer was part of the support team. And you'd get like these questions like, hey, can I host this app on Netlify? Or can I do this with Netlify? And the challenge is like if you had a Django app or a Rails app, you couldn't host it on Netlify. And so we had to like have a yes or no question to like get people to answer that first before they come to us and say, oh, can I do something with Netlify? So that yes or no question was like, oh, do you use build tools? Like, do you bundle your JavaScript down to like a build directory, like a gulp or grunt or a webpack? And are you using JavaScript on the front end with like a little bit of CSS and like HTML and like is that what it looks like when you build it? Because like that was at that point, like in 2016, 2015, that was kind of it was different in normal like build processes for like multi-stage gulp like functions or whatever you would call those like pipelines. And we saw like a renaissance of like the build tooling got better. So like now you have Vite, which like that gives you an amazing experience that you don't have to think about. But before we had to like look at Webpack configs. So the answer to the question, yes or no, is your stuff ready to host on Netlify? We put this term together, which is JavaScript APIs and markup. And the question was like, is your stuff Jamstack? And it's like, what's Jamstack? You Google what is Jamstack, and then we had Jamstack.org. And that was it was marketing. It was like the way to quickly answer the question so we could move on and build some other stuff, but would not have to like handle every single edge case. So then we figured out what our ideal customer was or ideal user to deploy sites, and that was Jamstack. That's evolved since, obviously, because now we have, thanks to Next.js, you gave like the illusion of server-side rendering. And now we actually have server-side rendering back in our React applications with React Server components. So now there's a lot of like serverless functions that do a lot of that work, or like Vercel does their own magic as well. So then now, is it still Jamstack or is it just modern websites? Who knows? But we're seeing React like a majority of, I think it was 80% back 2 years ago of front-end websites were powered by React. So at that point, what's next?
Yeah. A little bit of a pun there too. What is next?
Yeah. What is next? I mean, that's the next question we're going to ask. Like, what are we doing over here with this next 15, 14, 16? But yeah, I mean, that is a bit of pun, but also unintended.
Yeah. So let's get back to that, the genesis of Jamstack. So what before you had the term Jamstack, what were you calling it? Like, was it static sites, or were you saying I think you mentioned build tools there. How would you talk about it?
Yeah. Yeah, so there was so Jekyll was probably one of the bigger ones back and around that time of static site generators. And there was like advent of like a lot of new static site generators coming out built in like a language of choice. But I think it was like Pelican and like Python. Obviously there was like Jekyll, and then was it Middleman? I forgot what it was
Yeah.
called, but
Yeah.
there was
Middleman. Yeah.
yeah, Middleman. Yeah, man, it's been a while since I even thought about that name. But then Gatsby also came out around that time, and Gatsby was like, oh yeah, we can do some cool React stuff, static site generated. Next came out a couple years later, but there were all these build tools. So what we did is we built this site called staticgen.com, and there were a bunch of like a list of stuff that you could pre-deploy a site from Netlify, and that was what we had. Like it was either that or npm start or
Mm.
npm run dev. Like I don't even think run dev was even like the norm. npm start was like what everyone was using, and it's actually kind of like I always marvel on like how folks can complain today, but like oh this is the worst experience ever, or like why are we still using Express? And the answer is like that's what we had. That was what was innovation, and like we got given to the community and open source drove. And it's like easy to like say okay, well if you're not using Bun, like don't even like talk to me. But like Bun didn't exist until only a couple years ago. So I think what we saw like around that time in 2016 is JavaScript fatigue. A lot of folks were trying to keep up to date and trying to figure out like how do you build a modern site without needing to always rewrite stuff every like 6 months to a year. And you saw at that point you saw a bunch of companies like Airbnb explored like their Rails shop, Rails app, exploring a bunch of React stuff and how to get like React on Rails. Pinterest was a Django shop, Python, and they had this like internal library called Denzel that rendered view templates. They switched over to React from
Hmm.
Denzel. But like if you walk down Soma, I don't know if you've been to San Francisco, but like every in Soma, every like big tech startup that IPO'd in the last 4 years, well, not the last 4 years, 4 years prior to the last 2 years, because no IPOs really. They're all on the same street. Like we all went to the same meetups and conferences and hung out with each other. Like they used this thing called React Tuesdays. That Michael Kino would go to like Pinterest or Facebook or Airbnb and get the community just to have lunch together at a tech office that provided lunch and talk about problems in the ecosystem. And I think that part of the reason why React took off and like won the way it did is because they actually had people in the room offline
Mm.
talking to each other. And they had a really good Facebook group as well, ironically, that you could also talk to the community and the core team as well. But yeah, this like even looking back, build tools, like at that point, you had to take your server rendered or even like just your JavaScript as a whole and then bundle it down into HTML files. And a lot of that really centralized around Webpack eventually. So Webpack is what really won. But going back to my React Tuesday thing, like Webpack won because everybody at those lunches and those meetings, they all centralize on Webpack and Babel
Mm.
to solve the problem. And like, if you're going to have all the energy of the biggest companies in Soma or in San Francisco working on this problem together, you're going to choose the one that has the most energy. And I think it's nothing unlike of what's happening today with like now a lot of folks are on Next.js. I think there might be a shift happening to like something new. But for now, like Next.js seems to be the dominant React framework right now.
Yeah. So what do you think that something new is?
Yeah, that's a
What?
good question. I've been looking at Remix. I mean, we consider using Remix a couple summers ago when we built a new version of open source, and it was like Remix or Next, and
Mm.
we ended up going with Next based on what I mentioned. But now when you look at like where Next is headed and like how they do have a lot of React core team members at Vercel working on Next full time, but like Remix still gives you a bit of what we were coming from, where you could just worry about React components and not have to worry about like all this extra stuff that comes along for the ride. A lot of the stuff is batteries included. I'd say like Redwood.js has a good chance as well. They
Mm.
have a good amount of like startups who are building on Redwood.js. I think we got to see some of those startups mature to like a level of Spotify to like
Yeah.
see that adoption curve really go up into the right.
Yeah, it feels like they're really playing the long game, which you kind of have to in that world.
Yeah, it's like well, back I don't know how long you've been in the game, but I mean I've been doing this about 10 years. I was a career switcher, did sales, and then eventually started engineering at startups because I thought that was better than picking up the phone every day. Um, but 10 years ago, like Ember JS and Backbone and Knockout like were the things that I had to make decisions on. And Angular was like a thing, but Angular was always like, oh, that's like the enterprise,
Yeah.
like it's like batters included, sort of, but there's like another way to write stuff. It's great if you just don't want to think about day to day. But like Ember.js is what I ended up choosing to learn and us to adopting it at work. Um, and like Ember.js is like it's still around, like still a good community of core folks who've been on for a bit. But like you've seen the shift move into the React side, and I think at the end of the day, it's like use what works. And if what's working for you, it doesn't matter about the community. And like, so be it, do that. Um, but yeah, I was going back to like what I think. Like I think Solid JS has a good pun intended solid start. But like again, it's about the adoption. So like, if no company, no large community or team is backing it, it's going to be hard to see where it goes.
Yeah. So let's go back to the to closer to the genesis of Jamstack. So at that time, you're saying mostly Jekyll sites and like more staticky sites. How did you see that transition and then the development of Jamstack to more applications? Like what was the inflection point for getting more application heavy?
Yeah, I mean that I think the inflection point was the introduction of serverless. So
Yeah.
like I think in like 2017, 2018, Netlify embedded serverless functions as like a feature in their product. So not only and I was trying to give I was giving a talk at that time called serverless side rendering, and it didn't quite like the term itself didn't take off, but I think the idea of like serverless side rendering was truly a thing. So you don't have a server because you can't host a full-on Django application on Netlify or in like a static host provider. But there are some ways you can go hit a serverless function and provide some feedback back to give the illusion that something's happening in the server. So like if you got to go change a cookie or if you got to like check for dark mode or whatever it is, like you could do some of these like low lift things that you would
Mm,
always reach for server side rendering for. You could do on the front end alone. And I think as we saw Vercel added serverless functions, we saw like the advent of Amplify become a thing. Obviously, Azure has their own functions in their static web apps. You now have like this experience that you can kind of fill in the gap of like if you were building applications 10 plus years ago, you can now recreate those experiences in serverless functions. And that kind of really just opened up like what Jamstack was, but also what you could potentially do with only front end apps. So then you think like there were a lot of like good case studies. Like if you go to Next.js of folks doing really interesting things. So Next.js.org, they have got case studies. I think maybe Vercel's got case studies on their site as well. But folks just using front end tooling to do some of the like most complicated stuff and like rendering of like 3D images and interacting on like cartoonnetwork.com like was a good example of that. I think the Netlify we cited a lot as an example of like a front end only website. Um,
mm,
but yeah, fascinating stuff that you could do. And then at that point, like once serverless functions happened, a couple years later, edge compute happened.
mm,
So then edge compute, because the advent, like what we're really witnessing is like the cost of servers, this compute like the cost going down. Like it's an arms race at this point with all these like cloud offerings with Google and Amazon and Microsoft. So as compute is cheaper, and maybe it's cheaper for the entry level. So I would say like when you're a large enterprise, you're still paying lots of money, but it's trivial for me to start my company on AWS because I can get credits for the first 2 years of its life.
yeah.
So then edge computing of like now we have uh, what's interesting, and I don't know if a lot of people really talk enough about this. Like Planet has edge databases. Um, Edge GDPR compliant stuff is important. So if I'm in a grocery store in Germany and I scan my card, all that data about me has to stay local to Germany in a local warehouse. Oh, excuse me. Um, but that's like now fueling into like why edge computing, like it's not the only use case, but why edge
Mm.
computing is becoming bigger and better and faster. So I think that that kind of the inflection point was serverless functions to now edge to, I guess, going back to server components.
Yeah. No, the GDPR angle is really interesting. I hadn't considered that. Um, yeah, but it does make sense that serverless was that inflection point because now it's not a static site anymore. Now you're doing real compute um, per request, not just through Ajax functions. Um, so that I think that was also a point where it really pushed the definition of Jamstack itself. Because initially it was all about pre-rendering content and decoupling the front end from the back end. But now those lines are starting to get blurred a bit. Like, how did you see that play out?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the pre-rendering. Like, if you could build a bunch of sites and pre-optimize where you think the user is going to be going, like the onboarding path or the first couple blog posts that are recommended to folks on like a blog site or a news site, like that was the game. It's like how fast can you have like your first bite or your first paint? And I think I think I saw a tweet of like somebody was saying that like if JavaScript focus more on developer experience and less on performance, like we all would be happy. But there was a moment where everything was just about like milliseconds matter. And I think we got that. So now we're seeing all these new features added in that also are super fast. And we're all benefiting from this, but maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing. Like we should just make sure our product works for the user. But yeah, but going back to your like pre-rendering versus like the serverless side rendering versus server side rendering, it really comes down to like I think that that arms race about performance. And I honestly I think that's kind of like where we kind of lost our way with even things like Next.js. Like I don't get me wrong, I love Next.js. I think it handles a lot of stuff for me that I don't have to think about that I had to like hand build myself and React for years. And it took me a long time to jump into the framework game. But I think my team and myself are so much better for it.
Mm.
But I think the benefit that I think that we saw Next.js move into in like Next 14 is you don't have to think about whether it's server-side rendering, serverless functions, or whatever. It just does it for you. You don't have to think about that. I think that the introducing of the app router to like help support these like React server components is now making it a little bit more confusing. But at the end of the day, is like if we can get the job done, I think we would be fine. And that's all that should matter. The challenge is it is look enticing that if you don't have to think about some of these other harder problems that should be solved but aren't solved, that you now have to like we currently have app router and pages router in our next app. So now we have to think through different approaches to different problems and new features based on like what flavor of next we're at. So like we've now got a foot gun of tech debt based on decisions
Mm.
we had to make on when we can upgrade and when we can't upgrade. Um, which is it's literally it's distracting from the actual goal of getting users to use our product. So like I think at the end of the day is like this like transition or this like where we how we got here today, it really comes down to like we kind of hyper focus on the wrong things as a community as a whole. And I think I'm inclusive of this. Um, and it'd be really nice to get to the point where we don't have to think about this anymore. Like we had a sort of a glory moment when it didn't matter if you're Jamstack or not. We just knew that your site was going to build and it was going to be live on a page, and you pay $0 to like $5 for it. And now we're moving to a place where Vercel costs real money when you have a real product with real users, and we're kind of moving out of this like VC backed heyday, and now we got to really think about like what we're actually providing for compute.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Like, what for a tool like Next.js, I think for open source that it makes a lot of sense to use it because there's so many different you have static pages and dynamic pages and serverless, and being able to switch between those modes seamlessly and kind of get that almost free from the framework. you don't really get that in a lot of other places. Do you think there's use cases where that having all those tools and control is like overkill, or do you think it's just good to start with it because it gives you a lot of options?
Yeah, I think the tools, the controls and the tools, I think that if you have to ask about that, I think you might be asking the wrong questions. Sorry, not you in particular, but the developer. It really comes down to the goal. Like if I think a lot of folks who are building some of these Next.js apps are really doing it for like some sort of blog post or conference conversation. And I think it's valid. Like I think we want to move the entire industry forward by solving hard problems and being able to show it off. But if I work in an agency and my job is to turn a bunch of projects out really quickly, and I'm asking my team if we need to be using Pages Router or App Router, I think we've kind of like we're missing the forest through the trees. Where the bigger picture is like we should be churning out sites and making
Mm,
the company or the agency money. But a lot of times as developers, we can get a little too lost in the sauce about like whether we're using this tool or that tool. And I think what it really comes down to is like I'm in my late 30s at this point. Like I know what works for me, and I'm going to choose the thing that I'm going to build.
mm,
I know if my kid decides to be a developer, I know he's going to choose something completely different. And like, there's no world that I'm going to be teaching him Next.js, like out of college and be like, oh yeah, this is exactly how your dad built websites. This is the only thing you need to use. It's how your grandpa built websites. Like that's not even a thing. So like it's almost guaranteed when the next like the generation after the next one, which is like my kid, is going to use something completely different. And I think if the progress of like even that the question on Jamstack, is it dead or is it valid? Like where it's going to happen? Like it was always meant to have it in like a shelf life. So like folks will build Jamstack like the same way no one is talking with Lampstack's dead. Like Lampstack's still a thing.
mm.
People still build on it, but it's called WordPress now. And if you want to do anything else on the Lampstack, you'd be crazy to build your own framework because WordPress exists. So maybe the Jamstack is Next.js moving forward. And in 5 years from now, like we're not even asking like what the Jamstack is or where it went and what happened. We're just like, oh, that's we just use Next.
Mm.
And then the other thing that comes after that is like, okay, well, we're using the I don't know I can't keep up the acronyms because now my career has moved on to a different direction. Um, but I think what it's going to come down to is like, okay, new framework, new stack language, WASM stack or whatever. But give it 10 years and like we'll centralize into one thing.
Yeah. It's a scary thought of like teaching our kids web development in 20 years. Like it's such a long time in tech, and the thought of what we would even be at that point is a scary thought. Whether there even is the web as we know it.
Yeah, it's I was thinking about this because so I've got a Nintendo Switch. I got like man, I don't think I got it didn't come when it came out, but like a couple years after it came out. So let's call it like almost 10, well, maybe 8 or 9 years is when I got it. But it's like a 10-year-old system.
Mm,
Nintendo has not shipped another system since the Nintendo Switch. They've had new versions of it come out, like either the Switch Lite or the OLED one. But at the end of the day, the games still play. And like my son's 10 years old. Um, he doesn't care if he's on the light or the OLED one or whatever it is. Like if the games play, he's going to
yeah.
play them. And I think when it comes down to like, I think of like the consumer or the end user, if the site is running and it's working, they're going to it's going to show by usage. And there are some metrics like performance and drop off and like folks going through onboarding if things take too long to load. Like, yes, there are those metrics. But at the end of the day, like I think a lot of folks, we understand that when we click a button on our phone, it's going to space and back. So if it takes an extra millisecond, like we're still going to sit around and wait for it. Uh, but I know like in India and in Africa, like they now have broadband in certain places. But the thing that we always talked about 10 years ago was like, okay, most folks they preload all their pages, like cache them on their phone. So you like before you get on the bus, and you like let all the news articles load. You get on the bus, and then you have like 3 or 4 news articles in tabs on your Android phone, like ready to read.
Mm,
And that was a concept that like we were talking about pre-rendering back at Netlify is this is like if someone's gonna like pre-render a bunch of content so they can get on a bus with no Wi-Fi, no 3G or anything like that, and be able to like still use their phone and have something to look at, like what if we can pre-render stuff instantly and have it stored in a progressive web app or in a cache browser? So that way, even if they hit refresh or their phone dies, it's still cached within the browser. And as long as that cache is clear, you're able to read the entire website and article. And that's a now a solved problem.
Mm.
And now we're moving on to the next thing, trying to figure out if Apple will still support progressive web apps or whatnot, which was like literally what came out like last week, is whether they're going to continue to support it the way they should.
Yeah, yeah. Like yeah, caching can solve a lot of issues, right? And pre-building is almost the ultimate cache as well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. What do you think about there's the bandwidth side of performance. What do you think about the environmental side? I feel like it's something that's not really talked about enough.
Yeah. I mean, the environment, as in like servers actually polluting the environment.
So I think there's two sides. Like one that servers, like it's easy to think of okay, we're just going to put this on the cloud, but then you actually see a data center and it's racks of thousands and thousands of servers. But then there's also the like transfer and on the client side, like on your phone, the compute and power usage there too.
Yeah. I mean, this is stuff that we probably as a society continue to think about like the impact and what's happening. I was actually talking to one of my I'm friends with like the first employee at Dropbox, and like we every now and then we just have like a he's been super helpful because he started a couple companies. It was also early at a company that was successful, and we were having this conversation about like stuff like the environment. Like back in the 90s, there was an ozone layer had a hole in it. Like that's actually repaired itself. So based
Yeah.
on us talking and watching Captain Planet and recycling our milk cartons, we've actually been able to reverse that. And I think what happens is like once it becomes in vogue or a pop culture of like, hey, there's a problem, we should solve it. There's like a curve of like the end of the world happens at this date, and then there's like a point at which we decided we are going to pay attention to it, and things continue to like not end the world basically. So I would say with the advent of data centers and like the increase of throughput, because even like with electric cars, there's still a coal powered electricity plant somewhere powering houses. So then the question is, okay, well, solar panels. Then we put a bunch of solar panels in the data centers, but the solar panels, they use like some weird piece of mercury
Yeah.
inside the thing. And like that's not a renewable resource. So then we figured out somebody in MIT discovers a way to create solar panels that are all made of toilet paper. I don't know, whatever the case is, but I think the more we talk about, the more innovation we have opportunity for, and I think this is like why it's important to like have STEM in schools and have
Agreed.
opportunity for folks to like research and develop new ideas. And like I think we got a lot of flack for the whole paper straws and the turtles and stuff like that, which we could talk about that as well. But like whether or not we should be all drinking from paper straws, I think it actually open the question of like what other opportunities are there. So like in my house, we have these agave straws built from the plant, the agave nectar plants, just like a sugar cane. Agave has like an actual leaf and plant, like a stalk. Well, you can make a straw out of that, and that's a renewable resource, and it's better than paper straws. So you can drink a milkshake out of agave straw. But then we've also seen like a bunch of other ideas for straws. Do we need to have different straws than just plastic? Maybe not, but at least it got the conversation going.
Mm. Yeah. No, I think you're right. Yeah. I that's why I feel like we need some data around just trying to conceptualize like how much CO2 is a typical WordPress site emitting versus like a site on Next.js versus a static site. I think that would be a really interesting comparison. But unless we have the data for that, uh, it's just kind of pulling pulling ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's like opportunity for somebody who maybe doesn't have to worry about making money in their company because it's already making tons of money. Maybe Google or Microsoft nudging you guys. But like there's an opportunity for someone to do some research and development, like have a philanthropic arm of a company go figure this out. Um, it's like I don't say this because it's somebody else with more money's problem. But there's also folks who do have a bit of bandwidth and like would love to solve that problem and can take a grant or some foundation money to go solve that. And what I think what's been really fascinating is like seeing folks go and do that too as well. So um, former CEO of GitHub, Nat Friedman, he runs the AI grant, which is basically he's made a bit of money. Him and another co-founder of the AI grant. So they give money to AI startups to solve AI problems, whether it's computing or just using AI in a novel way. And what he's done, well, this is not part of the grant, but what like Nat real like legitimately did is he was able to translate ancient text using AI. So like these are like scrolls that were essentially you have to forgive me, I don't know what the scrolls are, but basically like ancient scrolls are basically it's hard like you can't translate the words because it's not all legible. So you're able to use AI to predictively um, anticipate or convert the sort of smeared letters into
Mm.
actual hieroglyphs and letters to then be able to translate using AI. And like would I be working on that? Probably not. Like I've got a couple of people to feed in my house, and I got to send kids to college, and I'd love to work on a little side project like that, but I don't have the bandwidth. But he does. And the other thing I was gonna mention too, like non sequitur, but also sequitur, what we talked before, like this whole transition to like what's next and what are the like technologies. The other thing we're really seeing is we're seeing a bunch of other providers providing hosting that are not just. I know we talked about Netlify and the Jamstack, but now you see Railway which is batteries included, also database hosting in a way that like Heroku kind of stopped short on.
Mm.
So we had all these hosts that were providing us like really awesome cloud hosting and providing that now Railway provides this. Render provides another thing where you could also provide Docker images alongside of your hosting. So if you do want to do some crazy WASM and compiling and talking to other databases and stuff like that, you can just drop a Docker image. Um, we're seeing the advent of cheaper compute now birth more options. So as a developer, we win because now I can choose, hey, I'm going to use my free tier on Render to host my random API for people to hit and not have to worry about Hacker News taking it down because it gets too popular. Um, and yeah, I mean that's the benefit of all this is that we're now seeing um, the progression of how developer experience and developer tooling is moving forward.
Mm. Yeah, that's really exciting space to be in. It's just yeah, fascinating to watch everything going on. I want to wrap up with one um, question just to bring it back to Jamstack. So you described Jamstack as having a shelf life, and maybe in a few years we'll just call it Next.js. um, I think we've seen a few cycles of, the web started off very simple. We added complexity to the point where we have this whole ecosystem of plugins and um, can render things on demand, and we have the whole WordPress world. And I feel like Jamstack was a shift back to simplicity, which gave developers more control, and I can now write the like pure handcrafted HTML I want, and have a lot more control over the tech stack. And over time, as we've hit more limitations in the use cases, like things have been added and opened up new use cases, but
Yeah.
have also added more complexity. Like, do you think that next evolution is is it adding more things in the browser? Is it just being more seamless between um, it doesn't really matter where the compute's happening, it's happening somewhere. And to your point, it's the site's rendering and it's just a better developer experience. Or is it getting back to that really, really simple kind of workflow? Like, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, you described the pendulum, and it actually reminded me of a talk I was giving when at Netlify about spacejam.com. So now spacejam.com now has the LeBron James version, but if you go in the Wayback Machine, you'll see the Michael Jordan version, which was like almost like a GeoCities-esque sparkly website that just works and was never touched almost since like 1997. Um, but the simplicity of like that thing will run forever. And if we never ruined the lore of Space Jam by letting LeBron James star in the sequel or the newer version, the remake, that thing would have lived forever. And there's a lot of sites like that that could just be hosted statically and never have to worry about. And I think like a lot of my websites, like briandouglas.me, it's like it just lives forever. I don't ever have to update it. Like the blogs will always be indexed, and I can go move on to the next thing I'm working on. But now we're moving into is like a world where okay, it can't just live forever. I gotta like, oh, I've got live JavaScript on this page.
Yeah.
What happens if some npm package decides to have a CVE or a vulnerability go live? I'm gonna go fix that. I can't let this live forever because someone's gonna hack into the database that's hosted directly on my railway that's connected through some npm package. And so like we're now seeing the pendulum swing into like those use that example is like it's not as easy to hack into your hosted railway app or whatever in your Postgres database, but it is easier to see what's happening. And I think we saw like a company like Resend where they had like a vulnerability where folks had full access to the database um, because on how things are hosted and how things are deployed. Uh, but and the idea of Jamstack, you bundle it and there's no live access to a server. Like it would actually have to be pinging a serverless function. And that's going to be harder to get into than almost anything else. So I see like we're going back to the server side, Web 2.0, and we call this, it's definitely not Web 4 or Web 3 or whatever we were trying to say. Um, but it is going back into like, okay, we can package our stuff together and get databases on the, like Neon is a good example. You have an edge database in a serverless, like a serverless database. Um, so now we've got that. Perhaps we go back to the world of like, okay, we want to go straight back to HTML. And like I've talked to all these companies. Like I know Begin also has a statically built HTML. HMX also has their version of this.
Yeah.
Like now we have these like, let's go back to HTML and how it was. We can view source and just do that. Um, so I mean, it will always go back and forth. And I think we're always like, I imagine I've got I guess a 16-year-old niece now at this point. I'll have to I gotta do some math to find out how old she is. But what's cool for her in high school is cassettes. And they're collecting cassette tapes, which I'm
Wow.
like, dude, cassette tapes, that was like elementary school for me. Like I barely scratched the surface in that and I went straight to CDs. And now you're just using cassettes because it's cool. So like how long until CDs become cool? And how long until
Mm.
DVDs become cool again? Um, so or laser disc, like if we want to go that far. So I think it's gonna be that. Like we'll have some nostalgia and we'll have some like random indie band that builds their website on tape databases. Um, but I mean, I think that's healthy for us to like be nostalgic of what it used to be because I think going back to what we used to have helps fuel innovation and growth moving forward. So if we're like, and I think it's a problem also, it's a benefit and problem of developer tools and experience is that we always assume this is the best thing ever. But like what really was happening with React is PHP. Like Facebook was popularly built on PHP, and they had a very elegant way on getting your server components into your PHP application. And we got JSX out of this. We got a bunch of other cool stuff out of this. And now we're getting server components alongside of it. And like it's a beam and a joke, but it's true. Like we're kind of just building what we already had like 10, 15 years ago again. And then you look back 10, 15 years ago, and like we'll probably end up like we'll probably be like deploying to whatever the bell bottoms of the internet is. But uh I digress. Like it's cyclical. And I think because the web is so young, it's hard to see the cycles. Because like we feels like we're just like a upward curve, progressive line. But what's really happening is like we're kind of going up to the right and then circling back and then circling back. And then that's how we get the momentum of bringing the old heads into the room to help tell us, oh, yeah, this has been done before.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like there's all approaches are good for different things. And it's just like remembering those lessons of each one as well. Yeah. Just to
Or
take on.
at least is listening to the lesson. Because there's a good talk about from Steve Klabnik, who was like core team he was core team Rust, but previously core team Ruby. Uh, and he did a talk about how Ruby developers could be so much better if they just listened to Java developers because everything they were building already existed in the JVM. But
Mm.
Ruby developers felt like they were too cool for school, so they never even listened. Like it was a great talk. I forgot what it was, like a Ruby conf years ago. But you like think like Ryan Dahl and like Deno and Russ. Like there's always going to be that talk of like, oh, if we just listened or if we just tried what was already there, or we just all became Java developers, like maybe we'd all be okay.
Mm. That's where I started off, and I'm not sure I can go back now.
It's
But yeah,
never too late.
just bringing back your analogy, like I started collecting records. Like I have Spotify, but I like I like being like very intentional about actually owning something and selecting a track. I find Spotify, I'm just I'm almost like passive in my music listing. It just the algorithm is doing it for me. And yeah, it's just recognizing there's pros. Like I've discovered a lot of awesome music through Spotify, but there's also cons to that as well. And it's the same with approaches to website, and I feel like that's what the cycle is.
Yeah, indeed. And I've got a whole box of records as well that I haven't looked at since I thought it was cool to collect records again. Um, but yeah, we're all here, kind of moving along through the cycle and just hoping that no one moves our cheese.
That's a great note to finish on. Brian, thank you so much for joining today. This is great.
It's a pleasure.
That's it for today's interview. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org.